Okay, let's get started. So, good morning, good
Uh,
afternoon.
Sorry, Raj. I'm supposed to do a brief technical announcement beforehand.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, and I think it will buy you some space as the attendees are flowing in as
Okay,
well.
that makes
Yeah,
sense. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you so much. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is the session titled Improving Business and Human Rights in Transboundary River Basins in South Asia. I'm Prabina Shrestha from Q Design, and I will be a technical facilitator for today. Both the chat function and Q&A will be on, so if you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function. Please note that the session today is recorded. If you have any questions about Zoom or require technical assistance, please feel free to privately message TF Prabina for help using the chat box. I will now hand over to Jyoti Raj Patra. Raji, sorry, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Pravina. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us today. I am Raz, and on behalf of Oxfam, Cuts International, and the Asia Water and Climate Partnership, I welcome you all to today's pre-forum session. This session will be exploring the business and human rights issues in some of the transboundary basins, but also looking at examples from Southeast Asia. I have the honor of moderating this all-female session today. But before that, please allow me to set the scene for this discussion. The session is focusing on transboundary river basins, and that's, I think, one of the key things that we'd like to explore a bit further. So why transboundary rivers? So firstly, transboundary rivers are vital ecosystems that support and sustain the livelihoods of millions of communities, as we all know. For example, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna basins are home to more than 630 million people in South Asia. They are key to the economic growth of the countries as they meet the water needs of various economic sectors and industries, including agriculture and fisheries, which are the primary sources of livelihoods and incomes for many of these communities. And according to the China Water Risk Report, which came out in 2018, the Ganges River System, which is a transboundary river system between China, India, Nepal and Bangladesh, it generated an estimated 790 billion USD of gross domestic product, which is GDP. Most importantly, these transboundary river systems are also the hotbeds for business investments linked to different kinds of infrastructure development, industrial projects, and extractives, such as riverbed mining for sand and gravel. And these business investments and development projects can directly or indirectly impact the human rights issues related to access to safe and clean drinking water, safe environment, ecosystem services such as agriculture, fisheries, and water for irrigation. The second important aspect why we're focusing a bit more on transboundary river systems are because these river systems and the basins are also some of the most climate sensitive regions, and they often witness frequent floods and droughts and other climate related disasters like GLOBs, the glacial lake outburst floodings and landslides. And these climate induced hydrological changes in the river systems have far-reaching impacts on the river ecosystem, as well as on the livelihoods and other economic systems which depend on these healthy rivers. The third aspect why we are having this conversation today is also linked to the recent report, which was presented to the Human Rights Council by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment. The report which he presented on the 3rd of March, early this month, titled Human Rights and the Global Water Crisis, highlighted people's lives, health, and human rights to a safe, clean, and sustainable environment, and the ways it is impacted due to devastating impact of the global water crisis. And many such impacts like water pollution, contamination, declining groundwater, floods and droughts are more pronounced in the transboundary river systems with many cross-border impacts. For example, the Ganges River system is the second largest plastic pollution contributing catchment in the world, estimated at around 0.12 million tons of plastic discharged per year after the Yangtze River in China. And lastly, just to put this into context, TROSA, the Transboundary Rivers of South Asia program, commissioned a regional scoping analysis of business and human rights issues in the GBM river basins. And the analysis suggested that there is limited understanding and consideration of human rights issues in business investments and infrastructure development decisions in many of the transboundary basins in South Asia. And existing mechanisms such as environment impact assessments, EIAs, are inadequate in capturing the human rights issues and other internationally recognized principles such as prior informed consent, which is called APIC, to protect rights of indigenous communities are not properly followed. And today's webinar builds on some of these findings, and I'm pleased to introduce the panel to discuss this critical issue and share their thoughts and insights on the way forward. Very briefly on this session, this is divided in 3 sections. The first section, where each speaker will share their experiences and insights on specific business and human rights issues in transboundary rivers context. And in the second section, their intervention will focus more on the suggestions and way forward to address specific issues and gaps identified in the first section. We would like to have a more interactive discussion at the end. So I would like to encourage the participants to share their questions, their suggestions in the Q&A function, and we will spend almost half an hour per question and answer at the end of this session. So without further ado, let me first of all welcome and invite our first speaker for today's session, Ms. Salima Ahmed. Ms. Ahmed is Member of Parliament, Bangladesh, and President, Bangladesh Women Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Ms. Ahmed, from your experience in Bangladesh, both as a parliamentarian and an industry leader, how business and human rights issues related to water and river are addressed, and what are some of the major initiatives, learnings, and gaps? So if you could please share your initial reflections on those things. Over to you, Ms. Salima. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the moderator and distinguished panelists and all the viewers and listeners. A very good afternoon. When Bangladesh is celebrating their 50 years of independence and also celebrating the birth anniversary, 100 years birth anniversary of our father of the nation, one of the thought and this when we are celebrating, some scary thought comes always in mind, that what will happen after 50 years, because things will not be the same, and things are not the same within these 50 years. So how we are going to see our children and our next generation. As all of you know, that Bangladesh is one of the vulnerable country, and also it has been in global climate risk and the ranking index of 2020. So Bangladesh, the best part, Sheikh Hasina, she made it 2100 for the year 2100 Delta. But just coming back to the scenario of Bangladesh, that Bangladesh livelihood depends on river. whatever we are now economically, it is because of river. And also, if you see that even now, rivers are the main transport for transferring commodities, and even any industry which need to be established, they first see that whether there is a river there, because if river is there, cost of the transportation become much lower. But the problem is that how we have used or misused the river. Sand mining, dredger, this has really affected. Even in my constituency, it is situated in Titash river, and I see every year during the monsoon season, there are sort of many dredgers are there, and people are doing it without informing the lawmaker, and they're making huge money. And we have also seen that lots of houses are gone. And who are affected? It's the women who are affected. And also, not only that, the agri lands are becoming with color. And that also is very alarming. You are losing your land. And second, whatever the land you have, that is also not good for harvest. So one thing Bangladesh government has done, that when we were seeing that lots of dyeing industry was coming up, and during that time, and our Buriganga river, if you go, it was such a beautiful river. But now when you go, I remember, 3 or 4 years back, I was traveling. I was going to Hatia, one of the island, and all the water of the river was absolutely like a black mobile, when the mobile becomes darker, something when you want to throw it out, the engine oil, it is like that. So what government has done, that any dyeing factory you have to establish, there has to be a ETP plant. Without that, no one can produce. So this has, I think, helped. But even now, all the wastage are thrown into the water. And as I said, the river has become a victim of the development and for the industrialization. So it cannot continue like this. We are talking about compost fertilizer, because we also know that the chemical fertilizer we used to use, that also hampered. So many mistakes we have already done, and now it is time that it's a survival time. It's not about business anymore. That how much you can earn, okay, you don't earn. It is about people's life, because if we continue like this, our next generation and our children cannot live like this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ms. Salima, for highlighting some of those experiences from Bangladesh. And as you rightly pointed out, the river has become a victim of development. I think that's very clear in terms of how the current development trajectory, including business investments, without considering the negative impact on the environment, and particularly you highlighted the impact on women. And I think that's something we would like to discuss further as we go into the discussion. So now moving on, let me turn to Ms. Kiran Pereira, founder and chief storyteller for Sand Stories. Kiran, first of all, I would like to congratulate you on your new book, Sand Stories.
Thank you very much.
And as someone who has been very passionately following the global sand crisis and also working on solutions, how do you see the sand and other riverbed extraction investments and businesses impacting human rights, not only from South Asia, but from other regions where you are working? And what, according to you, are some of the underlying drivers or gaps? So over to you, Kiran. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raj. I'd like to share some slides because it's quite a visual thing. Let me know if you're able to see my slides.
Yeah, it's fine, Kiran. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. So sand and gravel are the most consumed commodities on Earth. The scale of the challenge is so huge that the UNEP has called it one of the major sustainability challenges of the 21st century. And you can see on the screen, the top users are construction, land reclamation, beach nourishment, so dredging, all these sorts of users, industry, energy sector. Concrete, for example, is 60 to 75% sand and gravel. All the metal objects that you see around you, most of them have been produced using an industrial method called sand casting. So for every ton of molten metal poured, we require 3 to 6 tons of sand and sand. Glass, for example, is 70% silica sand. So even the energy sector requires tremendous amounts of sand and gravel, whether we are talking about the fossil fuels, so extraction of natural gas through methods like fracking, or whether you're talking about construction of dams, which require tremendous amounts of concrete, and again, which is 75%, 60 to 75% sand and gravel. And most of these aggregates are extracted from river systems. So they cause tremendous amount of destruction. Just to help you understand the scale that we're talking of, there was some recent research by Professor Daniel Franks from the University of Queensland's Sustainable Minerals Institute. If you look at the amount of gold that has been produced in all of history, it would fill about 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools. If you look at the amount of sand and gravel that we extract every year, it wouldn't fill even 10 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. So that's the kind of scale that we're talking about. Obviously, like the previous speaker has highlighted, this has tremendous impacts. People are losing homes, countries are losing infrastructure, rivers are being decimated because of the constant 24/7 extraction. It has impacts on the rights of people who are dependent on the river. So it even impacts the health of people. You have child labor. You have, for example, a picture of this boy who has to dive up to 20 meters below the river just to fetch without any protection or safety equipment. It has impacts on fisheries. And we're also seeing increasing violence connected to the sand mafia. In India, for example, 193 people were killed in the year 2019, 2020. So I'd like us to take a step back and consider this. And this is where I'll stop for now. The 20th century saw a 23-fold increase in natural resources used for building. The question that we need to ask ourselves, exactly like what the previous speaker has said, can we continue along this trajectory? Are there solutions? And I have solutions, but I will discuss them in part 2. And this is where I'd like to end this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Kiran. Thanks for highlighting the scale of the challenge, the scale of the sand mining, and also particularly the issue related to, mostly related to conflict and violence from the Indian example. And I think that's one area where as we move into the next session, we can discuss a bit more on the solutions. How can some of these end users that you highlighted, including buildings, glass, and other end users can play an active role in ensuring respect for human rights and uphold those rights in these particular business endeavors. Now moving on from sand mining to plastic pollution in transboundary rivers and the issue of marine litter. I'm pleased to invite Ms. Natalie Harms, a Program Officer, Marine Litter from the Coordinating Body on the Seas of East Asia, COPSEA in short, Secretariat at UNEP. COPSEA is one of the 18 regional seas program, and it brings together 9 countries from Southeast Asia. So Natalie, if you could kindly share some of COPSEA's experience of working with governments, business in particular, and other stakeholders to address plastic pollution and marine litter issues in the region. And what has been some of the key learnings for you, and some of those things we could discuss further as part of the next session. So over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Raj, and hello to everyone. So as Raj rightly mentioned, COPSI focuses on the East Agency. So this is Southeast Asia and East Asia, but I think there's a lot of similar challenges and some lessons learned also with South Asia. And to give some background, one of the regional priority issues that COPSI countries have identified is marine pollution, and including specifically plastic litter. And in 2019, countries adopted a revised regional action plan on marine litter. And this is the document that guides countries in addressing this transboundary issue. Why do I mention plastic pollution and marine litter in this context? Because it is very much a transboundary issue. So plastic products may be produced in one country, they're exported and consumed in another country. Waste is leaked often into rivers and waterways. That crosses borders. So something that enters the Ganges in India might end up in Bangladesh. And litter found on one country's beach may have traveled across ocean currents from somewhere completely different. And plastic waste is of course also traded across borders. So this transboundary issues requires of course a local and a national response, but also regional coordination and a response at global level. And this is why this is one of the priority issues for many regional seas, including in South Asia as well. And why is this a business and human rights issue? Because plastic pollution impacts human health and it damages ecosystems that millions of people in the region depend on for food security, for instance, as Raj rightly mentioned, in the Ganges-Brahmaputra Meghna Basin. And businesses who produce and sell and trade and recycle plastic products, they have a fundamental responsibility alongside governments to protect these people's human right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment. So along with many other environmental challenges, some of them other speakers have already mentioned, plastic pollution hits the most disadvantaged groups the hardest. So this includes local fishing or farming communities in river basins, along rivers, on coasts, that are, their fishing grounds are flooded with marine litter, it damages their boats, they ingest harmful substances with the fish that they eat, the plastic litter clogs up the waterways and there's increased risk of flooding and so forth. And another vulnerable group also includes informal waste workers across South Asia and Southeast Asia, who are largely responsible for plastic sorting, collection, recovery, recycling, because many of the waste management systems in our region are lacking or they're overwhelmed with the sheer amount of waste and plastic waste that they have to deal with. And these waste pickers, of course, face a social stigma. They have little access to social protection and healthcare. And this has become worse during COVID, where there's also an increase in hazardous waste and less safe spaces to sort waste. So in short, plastic pollution is a human rights threat and a threat to the environmental rights of all people, but especially those more vulnerable groups. And what COPSI and what UNEP and other actors need to do, and what we are doing, is of course working with governments, coordinate regional responses to these transboundary issues, but also very much working with businesses, raising their awareness and increasing understanding and capacity to build due diligence in their value chains, to create mechanisms for redress for workers and also for people who are affected by lacking waste management, and to keep in mind in the way that they design products that they should be designed for recyclability, using recycled products. But it comes down to very simple things that many businesses might not be aware of, that for instance, the labels of what types of plastic there are, or the many different types of plastic that are used, for instance, just for a bottle, are so difficult to recognize and separate for informal waste pickers sometimes. And these are the systems that we largely depend upon. So this is where we're working with governments, we're working with businesses, we're working with academia and civil society, for instance, through our regional marine litter project, Sea Circular, to build that capacity and to identify solutions and pathways that are not only good for prosperity of these businesses, but also for people and for the planet, and to help these businesses to build back better after the COVID pandemic and to invest in green solutions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks for highlighting some of the learnings from the COP-C initiative, the Sea Circular project. And also this is, I think, one of the key important lessons from the South Asian context is the way there is a regional response to this transboundary issue in the Southeast Asia, and also working with the private sector and ensuring that they have the awareness and they have the political will to invest in some of the due diligence practices that you highlighted. Thanks, Natalie. Our next speaker is Dr. Beena Vidyadharan from CUTS International. Beena is a fellow at CUTS, and she has been working on inland water and trade issues in the Brahmaputra, Ganges, Meghna systems for almost 6 to 7 years. And I would like to invite Beena to share some of the experiences from CUTS work, particularly related to working with informal traders and ensuring that some of those informal traders and the businesses they are part of, particularly the small and medium enterprises, how do you engage with them on issues of business, human rights, and what are some of the challenges that you encounter while you're working with this informal group and also the MSMEs? So Beena, it's over to you.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you for this opportunity to be a panelist among eminent speakers. Let me share some of our activities which CUTS has been doing in the river basins of Ganga and Brahmaputra over the last few years. As you all may be knowing, Ganga and Brahmaputra being originating from the Himalayan mountains, they not just carry water, they also carry a lot of sediments and energy also. And they support the livelihoods of more than, say, 600 million people covering the 3 basins. Now, there are a lot of industrialization happening, a lot of infrastructure development happening, urbanization, and everything that has led to the degeneration of these rivers. And rivers and not just rivers, even the riverine communities are getting vulnerable to various kinds of disasters, climate-induced disasters, as was highlighted in the introductory remarks. Now, let me just share the case of inland water transport, which is being heavily promoted by the government of India and Bangladesh as an alternate means of transport to shift cargo from roads to waterways. And a lot of development has been happening in this end, building of terminals, bridges, fairway development, dredging operations, etc., etc. Now, how this is going to affect the communities over there? Of course, there are displacement issues when you acquire land for building terminal and freed villages and all. But other than that, there is also another human right which is involved, which is the right to livelihood or right to have equal opportunities. Now, when a bridge is coming up across a river, the river is, say, it's massive river, about 20 kilometer width, and the bridge itself is 18 kilometer. So that's going to replace the operation of small boats that used to be there and displace about thousands of mechanized boat owners and even the people whose livelihood is associated with those boats. And when the pillars are being erected in the water, the construction work will continue for a few years, and that again is going to change the morphology of river, and even the fishermen communities are affected out of this. Now, are we even listening to these communities, or are the communities aware of this kind of outcomes from these development interventions? Of course, connectivity is important for the local economy and for the larger economic growth of the country as well. But there are issues of consultations and consent associated with these kind of interventions. Let me take the case of dredging. Dredging is immensely important in rivers of Ganges and Brahmaputra because of heavy siltation. And without dredging, vessels cannot move. And even the moment a vessel can induce, the waves can induce pressure on the banks, and that may lead to erosion. Again, the communities are vulnerable to erosion. Erosion takes everything from them. It's floods, they're used to floods every year, like they face every year, and flood is important from agriculture perspective also, because it brings in a lot of sediments and nutrients. But erosion takes everything from them in few minutes. So these kind of issues, communities are not even aware of the consequences of such development, and they are not involved in the process right from the beginning. That's what we noticed during our work in Brahmaputra Basin. Now, take the case of the Nitab community in Varanasi. It's a holy city in India. So these communities, they are known as son of Ganga. So they know the river much better than anyone else. And their concern is that, whenever government, let it be the state government or the central government, they plan any interventions, they are not taken, their voices are not taken into account. They would like to be, even they support disaster relief mechanisms during flood every year, and they want to be in the positions of river pilot or any other opportunities that is associated with the development. Of course, infrastructure development will provide employment for few years, and that's just it's just project based. Once the project is done, then they are back to the same situation. That's not a sustainable solution. So this is where the importance of community level consultations, not just community level consultation, even discussion with other stakeholders are also necessary. By looking at the trade happening through India and Bangladesh and comparing it with the investment which is already being done in for the sake of developing terminals and even dredging and all, we can see that the volume is not that much, and it is not adding value to the local economy or the local people who are living in the border areas of these transboundary rivers. Now, in one of CUST study, we actually promoted a short haul trade between immediate borders of India and Bangladesh, wherein small boats can take commodities which are locally produced across the border and trade with the communities over there. Now this, to materialize in the real sense, it will take some more time, but right now, small barges of 200 to 50 metric ton capacity are taking boulders from, which are from Bhutan. They are taken to the riverside of India by truck, and then it is loaded in the vessels and taken to Bangladesh. And this has kind of, opened the eyes of other local traders in the community, and they are now interested to use waterways as a mode of transport, and they also want to take part in this cross-border trade. So this is how evidence-based research and advocacy that can, even help community and the other stakeholders involved to place their position in towards a developmental goal.
Thanks, Veena. And I think some of the points you raised are very critical for us to reflect on, like raise these are we listening to these communities and the role for evidence-based research. And I think those are very important points. And as we are talking about research, I'm pleased to move on to Srishti, one of our young scholars and researcher from Nepal. And it is very important for some of these young voices to actively participate in these discussions and also lead these initiatives at different levels where they are working. So Srishti, if you could kindly share some of your own experience from the research that you are doing in Nepal, and particularly in the Mahakali River Basin, which is a transboundary basin between India and Nepal. And also highlight where do you see the opportunities for young practitioners like you to not only participate, but also to lead on some of these discussions and initiatives, either at the national level or at the sub-regional or regional platforms. So Srishti, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Raji. Through my engagements with Policy Entrepreneurs Incorporated, I've had the opportunity to work with local communities and actually understand their perspectives and views regarding these, external kind of activities that happen. And I too want to share a few perspectives from like a very communal level, and from a informal or like a local business perspective, because if we are to talk about business and the rights of local communities, and we are only talking from a large scale perspective, then I think it kind of misses out the picture, and we have to bring these local communities into conversations. That we have to talk about their experiences and livelihoods in this bigger framework. So I just want to talk about two cases from Nepal through my experiences. The first one is definitely my engagement with PEI on the Mahakali Basin as part of JOSA's initiative. And in Nepal, along many basins and sub-basins, sand mining is very much prevalent, and these are actually prevalent in very small scales. So of the total mining and quarrying enterprises in Nepal, more than 90% of them operate on a micro, small, or medium level. And in these enterprises, it's the local communities that are very much engaged. They're engaged as drivers, laborers, they're receiving sand, they're loading sand, and they're earning about, let's say, $10 to $15 per tractor of loading a sand, which is actually a good source of income for them, considering that this is an informal source of informal labor work. And there is a huge challenge here to strike a balance between the demand for sand, and then also ensuring that there's sustainable extraction of sand, and it's not actually impacting, there's a very minimal impact on the river ecosystem, and there's a long-term benefit to the society at large. So this is, it's very difficult to strike this balance between these two interests, and actually they're in direct conflict with one another as well. And we already know how these mining activities are impacting the ecosystems and river health in these areas. There's release of untreated processing effluents into the river. There's dust pollution from transporting these materials. The river extraction process is actually forming trenches in the river, and people are drowning in it and dying. And so basically the livelihoods of local communities are so much rooted in the stability of these local mining businesses. And unfortunately for them, these issues of livelihood take precedent over environment or sustainability. So it becomes very imperative that we have these strategic engagements with mining communities who are engaged in these basins. The second case I want to talk about is agribusinesses. So this case is actually not from a very transboundary river, but then it's actually because this is an agribusiness, and there are actually linkages to the transboundary systems as well. So this is a case of Taha municipality, which is around the central southern part of Nepal, which is actually a pocket area for vegetables, and it exports around $10 million worth of vegetables every year throughout the country and even to India. So these are actually locally owned agribusinesses, and they have been adopting agricultural intensification in a way that they're using massive fertilizers and pesticides to improve their productivity. Now, this is actually directly impacting their livelihoods and their security, their water security and food security itself. Pesticide accumulation in the water and food chain has demonstrated a lot of ill effects on these local communities. In this instance, there are a lot of men who have also migrated abroad for employment. So it's a lot of women who are engaged in spraying fertilizers or even in this agriculture. So we could see there were a lot of conversations around how women were developing uterine cancer. There were cases of skin allergies. Children were developing cancer. And the local fisheries were being affected. There was a massive decline in fish production. In just a period of 4 to 5 years, they reported a decrease of fish from 50 tons in a year to about 7 tons in just a matter of 3 to 4 years. So that's a large decline in the fishing population. And there were further impacts downstream, where there is the Chitwan National Park around the southern belt of this municipality. And here we can still constantly hear news of animals dying, of sudden death of rhinos due to water pollution issues. So it becomes very crucial to understand, gain perspectives of why these local communities are adopting these measures, and actually track the market mechanisms, the intermediaries or the agro-vets in such activities, and why they are resorting to these practices despite it harming their environment and impacting their water security and livelihoods. Also, because these businesses, especially the agro businesses, in these businesses, there are a lot of young people engaged, actually. As I said, there were a lot of people who were involved in foreign labor migration, but then there were also a lot of people coming back and getting engaged in these businesses. And I think a large part of the solution would be to engage with these young people through different forums and through business confederations that actually invest in young people and their ideas. And like maybe venture capitalists who play an important role in investing in the ideas of young people. So these young people and youth-led businesses, they can actually infiltrate the ideas of sustainable practices in these communities. And because we are talking about local businesses, it's important that we engage these local people, young people, with the training and support, and encourage these people to adopt sustainable practices, and because they're so at the heart of these communities. And yeah, I think this would be an important thing to do. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Srishti. Thanks for highlighting the local aspects of it, the need to engage with the local youth, and also, you highlighted how these locally owned businesses, most of them small and marginal, small and medium enterprises, how we can engage with them when we talk about these issues of business and human rights, which always, not always, but very often remains the discussion agenda for big corporations. But I think that's a very important point that you have raised, and how can youth play a role in this whole initiative. So thanks, Srishti. With this, we have come to the initial round of discussions, and I see many questions coming in the Q&A box. So before we move on to the questions, very quickly, if we can go to all the panelists, and I would like to request the panelists now to use the time 2 to 3 minutes to highlight any specific suggestion that you would like to propose, and if you would also like to reflect a bit on any of the questions that might relate to the suggestion. So with in this round, let me again start with Ms. Salima Ahmad from Bangladesh, Member of Parliament. So Ms. Ahmad, if you could highlight some of the things that, in your opinion, are going to address these critical issues of a river, particularly related to business and human rights, pollution, and the impact on women that you highlighted in the first round. So if you could highlight some of those things from your own experience from Bangladesh.
Thank you very much. We all know that the right to clean water is human rights, and it's a fundamental rights. And that actually has been established in the international human rights law. But how much safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is necessary, and we are all arguing and we're talking about it. But we are not enjoying that. And that's why law implementation is very important. Activists need to understand, not in a, very, they have to be diplomat, I think very straight away, taking out, putting and destroying everything is not the not the way. We really need to have more and more dialogues, and we need to engage more women, I think, because women are, I think, is the ultimate voice. And we know that when river gets affected, women gets affected. It's not only a fish or agriculture, but it is also about their safe drinking water. Because even now, I'm repeating it from my constituency, because when I travel, I always say, see, women are taking bath in the river and taking a bucket of water with her, and they don't want to have that tubewell, because we don't have, other than tubewell, we don't have water in my constituency. So tubewell, they don't want to have it. They prefer much more safer, cleaner water. So how we can do it? I think policies are there, but implementation is not there. And ultimately, we all know that who are the doing the corruption, but it is the private sector. But these private sector are not private sector. They are the corrupted people. So we have to also differentiate, because when an activist speak, environmental activists speak, they directly attack the private sector. But I think that should not be the case. We should differentiate between the private sector who are developing for the country, and the people who are just want to earn money. So these are something we have to do. Infrastructure development is coming up, river tourism is coming up. How we will handle it? Because river also has become a ways of entertainment also. So how we are going to use it? So we really need to think about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Ahmad. Thanks for highlighting the need for more dialogues, and particularly the emphasis on the need to engage more and more women leaders in this conversation, and also having constructive dialogues with the private sector and business associations. So thank you so much. If I can now turn to Kiran in terms of some of your suggestions and way forward as to how we can address these issues, mostly from regional perspective, but particularly engaging with some of the end users that you highlighted in your previous intervention. Yeah, Kiran, over to you.
Thanks, Raj. Right. So as the previous speaker said, policies exist, but implementation is poor. And in order to see effective change, we need to know that there are solutions out there. So I'm going to share with you some ideas from different parts of the world, and ideas that may spark potential, that may give ideas to the people in the private sector on the role that they can play. Here's a building built in Rudrapur in Bangladesh, built over 20 years ago with only mud, bamboo, straw, built by villagers themselves, based on a design by a German architect. She used the design of the houses that were built locally and implemented it in a scientific manner. And so you can see the quality of construction, absolutely beautiful, no cement used. And this particular building has withstood monsoon seasons for over 20 years. So you can see it's possible to build without cement and concrete, and beautifully. You find individual practices doing really, really interesting things. Here's a practice in Bangalore, in India, building apartment complexes with adobe and rammed earth. And that's a community college concept design that you see. Local materials. You also see similar action happening in other parts of the world. In Greater Paris, for example, there are this project called Cyclothere. They're using raw earth in order to construct buildings. Why raw earth? Because this material, if it's not bound by concrete, can then be reused and repurposed to build again once the life cycle of the building is over. It's great for human health. It does not impact the environment. So you see lots of experimentation like this. Waste-based bricks. Here are some examples of bricks made from construction and demolition waste. The picture on the left is a project on the 11th Avenue in New York. And the entire facade was made from bricks, which are made from construction and construction demolition waste. And you see on the picture on the right, it's a Starbucks drive-through in Europe, again, made from construction and demolition waste. You would never guess if you saw this. Absolutely beautiful buildings. Of course, if we're able to scale it up, and if the cities are able to get involved, then the kind of change that we can see is absolutely massive. The city of Amsterdam has aims to become fully circular by 2050. They're following Professor Kate Raworth's circular economy model. By 2030, that's less than 10 years away, they plan to halve the use of raw materials, new raw materials that are going to be used in the city. So that's the kind of ambition we need. And that's the kind of solutions that are available. And I'm sure we can build on this.
Thanks, Kiran. Thanks for bringing up some of those very inspiring examples from Bangladesh, India, France, and also from the Netherlands. And I think this clearly shows when you have the political will and the enabling environment for policy in place, I think many of these things could happen and we can really tackle some of those issues at the national level with such ownership and participation. Thanks, Kiran. Moving on, Natalie, in terms of your suggestions, particularly if you could highlight the idea of the regional cooperation issues that you presented in your previous intervention. And if you could also say a little bit more around engaging with the private sector in terms of the approach and, you know, some of these things that you have already tried in Southeast Asia. Natalie, yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Raj. So as I mentioned, I think coordination across countries, but also across stakeholders is really key if we want to tackle plastic pollution in a way that is truly sustainable. So not only for the environment, but also for people who are impacted by plastic pollution. And what the regional Cs can really do here is that they facilitate, they create a mechanism, a space for dialogue and for coordination across governments, across regions, but also, for instance, between science and policy. So very often, one of the issues that we face is that we don't have the right kind of evidence. We don't really know where is plastic pollution coming from? Where are these leakage hotspots? What are the flows, you know, along rivers, and how is it impacting the environment? How is it impacting people and economies? And I think that is one fundamental issue that can be tackled across countries. So having collaborative research, strengthening monitoring as well of marine litter and of plastic pollution, and sharing lessons learned. You know, I think across different countries, this is how it is in the COPSI region, but it's the same for SACEP in South Asia. Countries are all in a slightly different place and they all have slightly different approaches, but they face this common challenge. So creating this space where countries can share lessons learned, can share good practices, is immensely useful because none of us are starting from scratch. So this kind of multi-stakeholder approach and this coordination approach, I think, is very important if we want to tackle plastic pollution. And fundamentally, I think what we need is a shift to a human rights-based approach when we talk about any of these issues, including plastic pollution. So this includes, as I mentioned, building support, giving support, building capacity for impact assessment. So not only impacts on ecosystems and the services they provide, but also impacts on vulnerable communities, for instance, but also the role that they play in tackling plastic pollution, and also empowering all stakeholders. And this issue of participation that some of the other panelists have already mentioned. So making sure that in our dialogues, in our meetings with businesses, with governments, that we also include representatives of vulnerable groups, that we really try to understand their needs and their interests and make sure that these needs are addressed in the kind of policy support that we are providing. And I think fundamentally it's also about building transparency and accountability. So really applying this kind of rights-based lens to the policies, the regulations, the budgets as well, and the way that we invest in different projects. I think we always have to have that kind of lens of how can it be more transparent, more appropriate, and how can we hold governments and producers and businesses accountable and make sure that those municipal authorities that are responsible for these issues along rivers, that they recognize and protect, for instance, informal waste pickers and their contribution to waste management, and provide sorting spaces and safety equipment and so forth. So I think there's quite a lot that we can do. And fundamentally, what is important, not only doing it at the national level, but also coordinating approaches across countries, from harmonizing standards and regulations so that it's easier for businesses. They have this reliability, they know what they need to do to move to more sustainable production, but also harmonizing policy approaches and tackling this transboundary issues. And this is where regional CEIVs provide an important mechanism for that coordination.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks for highlighting the need for not only multi-stakeholder collaboration, but the need for more science policy interface. And I think that's also very critical when you are talking about business, human rights issues in transboundary context, and also the need for having more inclusive processes of dialogue and conversation, ensuring transparency and accountability. So I think these are very useful thoughts in terms of the way forward in tackling these issues, and also learning from the COP-C experience from Southeast Asia. Bina, if I can turn to you now in terms of your specific suggestions, building on what you said earlier, from your experience in inland water navigation, dredging, and also tourism. So some of your reflections on the way forward when addressing these issues, particularly if you could dwell a bit on the engagement with small and medium enterprises and the group that you work, the informal traders in the India-Bangladesh context. Bina, thank you.
Thanks, Raj. As highlighted by other speakers as well, the gaps mostly lie in the areas of research, consultations, consent, and the remedy process. When I say research, I mean both policy research and scientific research. Just look at the examples which Ms. Kiran has shared. Wonderful buildings using alternate materials. So this kind of research has also, this kind of practices also need to be shared with others. So sharing of good practices is one aspect that we need to focus on. The other thing is that prior to even research and all these things, we need to have informed discussions at community level, engaging the community. And this is where non-state actors and civil society organizations can play an important role. For example, under the Transboundary Rivers of South Asia TROSA program, Oxfam is organizing this, even Kutch is part of that, organizing Nadi Baithaks or the river meetings with the riverine communities along the transboundary rivers, wherein we discuss various issues concerned with transboundary rivers, let it be navigation, fisheries, or even floods, and actually empower community to raise their voice at different platforms. And these meetings, we see that women, children, and even youth took active participation in these meetings. So this kind of platforms can be encouraged at community level. The other thing I would like to underline is the relevance of dialogue. Even Kutch is organizing a public-private dialogue in the context of river cruise tourism, as mentioned by Ms. Salima. So this is to promote sustainable river tourism, because even the cruise operators, they can engage the communities at various levels, both skilled laborers and as unskilled laborers. And they can even train them on various etiquettes to be followed. And this is also a platform for local artisans and the craftsmen to showcase their activities, because the cruises, they take their clients to villages where they get an opportunity to interact with the communities and get to know their lives. So this is also another opportunity for the riverine community. So I would underline research, dialogues, consultations, as the steps to be undertaken, and definitely all this should lead to advocacy program with multi-stakeholders. As pointed out by one of the speakers, in most cases, the environment impact assessment and socioeconomic impact assessment or the strategic environmental assessment is not happening in case of any interventions in transboundary rivers, because none of the parties in the GBM basin, none of the riparian countries are party to the UN Watercourses Convention. So this is not mandatory for them to conduct this kind of assessments. Instead, politically, all the discourses on water is done on bilateral basis. So this is something we can, civil society can even engage with the respective governments in the riparian countries to stick to the principles of at least stick to the principles of UN Watercourses Convention, like principles of no harm, equitable utilization, cooperation, equity, etc. Thank you.
Thanks, Veena. Thanks for highlighting some of those issues related to research, dialogue, and also need for sharing good practices and multi-stakeholder forums where we also engage with the business and also the kind of principles which are part of the UN Watercourses Convention. And as you rightly pointed out, none of the South Asian countries are party to it. So there are definitely challenges and opportunities there. So moving on to Srishti. Srishti, from your previous intervention related to involving the youth, particularly the local youth, in some of these sustainable practices, less use of chemicals and synthetic fertilizers in the agro business, and involving them in some of the business confederation that you talked about. So if you could elaborate a bit more in terms of how you see this moving forward.
Yeah. First and foremost, it's really, really important that the roles of young people and women, they're not undermined or devalued. And they're not just seen as beneficiaries of any kind of activities that happen, rather as active agents who can bring about changes. And that is where I kind of reiterate all the previous speakers, what the previous speakers have also told about the need to create spaces of engagement for young people like me. And I'm really, really glad that I also received this opportunity to share a few of my words. I was also part of TROSA's Winter School program in September last year. And this was an opportunity for me to connect with a lot of young people from the region and, interact with experts, academicians, policymakers. And these kind of platforms are really, really crucial for young people like us to help us highlight our perspectives and bring our voices in the forefront. Engaging young people like us, especially local youths, would help in ensuring that the information that is being disseminated to the community with these local businesses is very understandable, inclusive, and accessible to everyone. And the discussions actually move away from very short-term gains to these longer-term mechanisms for sustainability, and maybe also talk about or share about different kind of benefit sharing mechanisms that can exist in these communities. So definitely a lot of involving young people, involving local communities in the research to understand the effectiveness of these actions, engaging them in advocacy forums, in public hearings, and offering them spaces for constructive criticisms is very, very important. And I strongly believe that the knowledge generated from these initiatives could actually be the basis for reform activisms or evidence-based policy actions. And definitely women should not be left out as part of these conversations, because a lot of women are involved in the informal sector, especially in these informal businesses. And it's really important that we understand their voices, we understand and bring in their perspectives while we design these interventions or policy actions. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Srishti. Thanks for that very passionate intervention. And you rightly pointed out, not only engaging youth as beneficiaries, but active agents, and creating that safe space for dialogue and constructive criticism. and involving more women. And I think that's very critical, not only from TROSA perspective, but also as we see, there is need for more and more women leaders in this kind of initiatives, and also most importantly in the business space. So when they lead on some of those issues, I think we are able to address many of these challenges that we are encountering. And it's a great moment for us also that we are having an all-female panel today discussing this very important issue of water, business, and human rights. We have some interesting questions in the Q&A chat, and I would like to kind of some of those questions are targeted to individual speakers, but there are some which are very generic. So I would invite the panelists to take on those questions depending on whichever you would like to reflect on. So I would like to thank Ram Charita Sa for all the 3 questions that are there in the Q&A box. The second one is to Natalie, I guess. So this is about, unless cleaning upstream like high Himalayas are done, how is it going to address the downstream so issues of plastic pollution? So that is one. And the one on government's lifting the environmental compliance in the name of ease of doing business. I think it is all across South Asia. So if Ms. Salima and Bina could reflect on that. And when the third one is when Asia is closed for being used for dumping ground of waste, including plastic waste from many developed countries. I think this is again related to the plastic waste. But Kiran and Srishti, also please feel free to reflect on, or if you'd like to stress upon any of the points you made before, let us do it that way. So if I can start with Ms. Ahmad, and we go in that order. Thank you.
So the question is about the many government and India in particular has lifting the environmental. You want me to answer that one?
Yeah, because it also says about other governments in the region. So if there is any specific,
I think the government should be careful and smart. Because ultimately the policies, as all we are discussing, that policies are important. Sometimes by helping the private sector, by saying ease of doing business, we cannot hamper the environment, because ultimately the private sector will be also hampered. So this is something in total. This is not something that you are benefiting someone and someone will be affected. This is something which everyone will be affected. I think promotion of people-centric and people-oriented water management is also very important, where we need to, the government need to think about it. And government also need to think about when they are doing this ease of business, it's fine, but how to improve the water management efficiently? Because whenever there is a policy, okay, this need to be done because the private sector need to do it. But on the other hand, yes, we are doing that, but what need to be done so that the waters are not affected? And in Bangladesh, we are a riverain country. So that trust need to be developed between the stakeholders, and we need to have frequent dialogue. Unfortunately, we are not having frequent dialogue. And we all know that, we need to see more increased investment in transboundary river arena, and then more dialogue will come up. Less you do, less dialogue will be there, and some people will take that opportunity to do the wrong things. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Ahmad, for highlighting the need for more investment and more trust. Kiran, if you have any last reflection, or you'd like to take any of the questions, please.
No, I think I'll leave the questions to the other speakers. They're far more qualified than I am to respond to those. I would just say that from a perspective of development, since sand seems to underpin development as we know it today. A grain of sand can be a grain of change, and there's tremendous change possible. So we need to believe that there are creative possibilities to this, and that's where I leave it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kiran. Natalie, in terms of the questions on upstream, downstream, and also the ACR being the dumping ground for waste, your reflections, please.
Thanks, Raj, and thank you for that question. I mean, I could speak about this issue for hours, but maybe just to say that, yes, of course, plastic pollution can only be tackled across the entire value chain. So this includes, important efforts that communities are taking to, clean up beaches and initiatives that are happening to clean up our ocean. But most importantly, of course, we need to prevent plastic pollution going into the environment and harming people who depend on these ecosystems in the first place. So yes, we do need upstream action. We need action working with plastic producers, putting in place certain regulations and standards, creating a market for recycled products. And this also includes making sure that plastic is actually valued correctly. At the moment, it is so much cheaper just to produce new products from virgin materials because fossil fuels are so cheap. So, tackling issues like fossil fuel subsidies, shifting generally our entire systems toward more greener energy production, that will also help shift that market towards greener products. So that's something that, needs to be done quite upstream, and also working with governments on improving their policies, of course, marine litter planning, circular economy, roadmaps, those kind of policies, making sure that, that it's a right mix of sort of bans and incentives for businesses, as well as education for consumers and communities, but also fundamentally changing our waste infrastructure and our waste systems, and making sure that we don't leave those people behind that now that we're really depending on at the moment for our waste management, so the informal waste sector. So I think, and all the way along that chain, and consumers as well, every one of us can make, a different choice, move away from single use or hard to recycle plastics, and really, ask ourselves, do I need to wrap this in plastic? Can I use something else? Do I need it at all? And really creating that market demand as well. That is something that can come from consumers. And just looking at, where does my waste go? Is there maybe in the cities that we live in, is there informal waste recycling? How should I sort and clean my waste so that it's easier for them to access and to recycle these kind of waste? So there's a lot that we can do, and we do need to tackle this all along the value chain and all at the same time. So all of us have a responsibility. And this sort of time for shifting blame has really long passed. And what UNEP is really doing is trying to facilitate this at the international level, of course. So United Nations Environment Assembly recently identified pollution as one of the big crises of nature that we need to tackle together, otherwise we will not be able to solve it. We can use regional mechanisms like the regional Seas, but also ASEAN and other intergovernmental mechanisms, and work with businesses and work fundamentally as well with research, with science, and with people, with the consumers, to create that kind of awareness. And there's many projects going on. I mentioned the Sea Circular project, where we're also working with OHCHR and UNDP and other agencies to build the capacity of duty bearers to really understand how can they shift the way that they are producing plastic, for instance. But there's also, this might be interesting, I'll just mention it briefly, a project called Countermeasure, which looks very much at plastic input along rivers, also in South Asia. So there's loads of projects all around the world. This has actually become a very busy space, and I think that coordination across these different actors is also a very important role that UNEP and that these different intergovernmental mechanisms play. But I might stop there, because otherwise I will continue forever. Just that there was another question, I think, on the dumping ground for plastic. Yes, this has become a big issue, trade, and especially illegal trade. of plastic waste, and this very much affects also very vulnerable groups in Asia and Southeast Asia and South Asia as well. But of course, we do have the Basel Convention, and this does also look at plastic waste and trade of plastic waste. And since the beginning of this year, there needs to be prior informed consent of the countries that are sending plastic waste for recycling, as well as transit countries and recipient countries. And it needs to be very clear what is traded, and dumping, has been illegal for a long time, but one of the issues here is really enforcement and having the capacity to enforce. And there's a lot of corruption going on. Plastic waste is a big business. So this is really something where we need to use the frameworks that we already have better to protect the people who are impacted by plastic pollution. But I really will leave it here. Thanks so much, Raj.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks for highlighting some of those regional opportunities, role for more science-based interventions and dialogue with the private sector. Veena, if I can reach out to you in terms of some of your reflections on governments easing the environmental compliances in India. So if you can reflect on it a bit.
Well, thank you for raising that question, very pertinent, because this has been quite in media ever since the new environment policy has been approved in India. Because in certain cases, the need of prior consultation has been omitted now. So I don't recollect the exact scale of the interventions, but though EIA has to be done, the consultation is not required in certain level of at certain interventions, which is going to happen. Now this would again enable business, or it's in the name of ease of doing business, and it's quite tricky also. Now what I feel that this is an opportunity for civil society organizations like us to be more vigilant, and even media can play a crucial role in this, to update the communities and the society of what are happening, the developments that is going to have. Does it have any kind of impact on the community? So sometimes it's both way. I agree to what Ms. Edima had said. You cannot take the approach of an activist every time. So there are pros and cons of every interventions, but right information is most, the right information is what matters mostly. So in that perspective, I think that civil society organization has to play a great role in this.
Thanks, Veena. I think the role of the civil society and more constructive dialogue is critical when you're talking about business, human rights, and environmental issues. I'm just looking at the time. Sisti, do you have any last reflections from your end?
Not really reflections. I just was thinking about the thing I talked about, agro-businesses. And while you were talking about the upstream linkages, I just realized that so there are a lot of actors in play in these kind of chains, and we have to identify these actors. And there was this one specific case of a young person who was running an agrovet. So agrovets are like, the doctors for these producers, for the plants. So they actually listen to these agrovets very well. So this young person who was an agrovet was actually trying to introduce new technologies of using, let's say, the IPM technology, which is more environmentally sensitive. And he was trying to promote organic use of fertilizers in the production process. So just, trying to trace these kind of different actors and say what important role even one actor can play in these larger processes. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
Wow, that's a brilliant example, Sisti. Thanks for bringing that in. If there are no more questions from audience, I would like to wrap up this session by thanking all the panelists for their brilliant intervention and also sharing some of their insights on way forward. I won't be summarizing this very rich discussion. So I think the questions that were raised were also very relevant and also interesting, particularly related to the need for more intervention across the value chain when we're talking about not only plastics, but for example, sand, which Kiran very brilliantly highlighted, or inland water navigation, agribusiness. So I think the whole value chain approach is absolutely critical. Dialogues are essential in terms of ensuring more constructive dialogues. And the most important thing for me, one of the key takeaways is engagement and involvement of more women in this space. And I think that's one of the key things that we need to keep emphasizing on as we make further progress on these dialogues. And with that, I would like to thank all the panelists. Thank you so much, the organizers, for giving us this opportunity to convene this pre-forum event. The forum will start from tomorrow, and I would like to encourage all the participants to engage. There is one particular session on plastics and human rights. So please take that opportunity to be part of that discussion. And thank you, everyone. And look forward to seeing some of you during the forum. Thank you so much.
Lastly, I would like to say that we need to involve women to shy away from the chemical world.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.